苏教授，然后语坛人廖教授各位老师，各位来宾大家好。那我们今天非常高兴请到芝加哥大学的苏元虚教授到这个政大来给我们一个讲座。那我们这个讲座是由这个政大的华人文化主体性研究中心所主办的哈。那我们这一个政大华人文化主体性中心是这个教育部的这个高教深耕计划所支持的一个研究中心。那我们这个中心叫做华人文化主体性，那基本上就是希望能够透过这个华人的文化的各个层面的表现来理解这个华人的身份认同然后透过这个方式，我们也希望能够引领一些这个华人研究的一个特别是汉学研究的一个新的这个方向。那今天我们为了这个目的我们特别成立了这个所谓华人文化讲座。那我们希望说邀请国际上的这个重要学者来就一个比较前沿的一些研究的议题，来提供一个比较完整的这个讲座。所以我们请了那个这个讲座的教授大概都来这边讲5次的这个演讲，希望能够把他们最新的研究成果系统的这个表达出来。那我们也透过这个网络的这个视频，那日后呢能够呢让这个世界上所有对这个汉学研究有兴趣、对华人文化的议题相关有兴趣的这个学者或这个其他这个研究者都能够透过这个我们的这个虚拟学院的这个网站的设置呢，能够看到今天这个演讲内容所以今天非常这个高兴的请到这个苏教授。那苏教授今天的一个讲座的这个总标题是殊方九译之俗，前现代亚洲的文学交流那我想这个议题对我们中心来讲非常重要，因为要建立一个华人文化的这个主体性，我们必须在这个所谓的现代的这个论述之前，理解在这个亚洲地区所建立一个文学这个社群它当初的这个整个交流的网络是怎么建立起来。那这样的一个演讲对我们这个华人文化主体性研究中心日后研究应该会非常有启发性。所以我今天非常的这个兴奋，这个能够来这边听这个苏教授这个演讲那也希望这次的这个演讲系列呢，能够呢引发大家的这个后续的这个讨论。我想这一个演讲的系列日后在这个台湾的一些文学的研究上，应该会产生很大的冲击作用。我们也希望能够把这一个演讲呢，以这个专书来出版那我希望能够扩大这个演讲日后在台湾的这个文学研究的这个影响力那非常谢谢这个苏教授在百忙之中能够答应来这个政大在这边做这个演讲非常感谢这个苏教授那我接下来请那个我们的博士后那个高崇龙教授来那个介绍一下那个苏教授的一些那个研究内容。
那我很快的介绍一下苏老师的研究。我觉得可能很多人已经对他的研究熟悉所以我不需要多说。那苏老师是芝加哥大学比较哲学系的教授。那他的研究对跟我们这个中心做的研究有很多共同点那苏老师的作品的研究很多，所以我今天就是提到一些我觉得比较我个人觉得比较重要的书比如说这个 The Problem of Chinese Aesthetics 或者一个 Great Walls of Discourse and Other Adventures in Cultural China both are quite important books of Professor Saussy。那最近他又发表一本我个人非常喜欢的书，就是那个 Translation as Citation Trans Inside Out 我觉得这本书的讨论的那个问题跟现在今天开始的演讲很有关系。最近也有发表一本我觉得很重要的很有趣的书 Are We Comparing Yet 我已经开始读它。我觉得他提到很多跟我们这个中心跟我们做比较哲学或者比较文学或者跨文化研究的人的很重要的问题。所以我们真的很期待听到苏老师的演讲我 确定它对我们想要确立的那个研究方向有很大的贡献啊，所以
所以我今天恐怕要用英文讲，因为我的思路如果要用英文，可能就比较完整一点，就不会那么有限。所以我先要问后面的那几位人士，那个音质行吗？听得到吗？录得到吗？好 ，OK。Wonderful, thank you. So my topic in these 5 lectures altogether is how cultural China has related to its outsides before the modern period. The limitation is important. Before 1850 or so, writers in China never thought of themselves as being under a cultural or social deficit. They were at the center of their world, and the edges of that world were inhabited by less educated, less capable, less cultivated, less organized people. That was never in doubt. After the Opium Wars, the situation changed. I think this is uncontroversial. That moment forms the beginning of the modern period in China, as we understand it today. In the pre-modern period, China is its own center. In the modern period, Chinese begin to see themselves as inhabiting a margin, as needing to catch up with others, to adopt what are variously called modern, global, or Western standards of thinking, behavior, and expression. Generally, when people narrate the shift in Chinese culture, they are about to launch into an account of Chinese modernity, its various crises, exaltations, and tragedies. I am more interested in the pre-1850 situation because it offers more opportunities for thinking differently about the present. And that is something we definitely need, as the conventional categories for thinking about history, culture, and the world order begin to fail us. Such reference points as the First World, Second World, and Third World, or the developed and developing worlds, or the free world and the socialist bloc, the global north and global south, the right and the left, the colonial powers and the anti-colonial or decolonial forces, the elite and the mass, the neoliberal corporation and the social democratic state, such terms no longer describe the situations we find ourselves in, although intoning such slogans brings the comfort of conformity in the absence of analytic understanding. The stories we tell about China are, of course, threaded through all these categories and must, I think, be told anew in a longer historical perspective and with greater readiness to admit ambiguity. Admittedly, cultural geopolitics is a vast and unwieldy topic, suitable for prophets and visionaries, and I don't claim to be one of those. As a way of finding access to this immensity, let us consider the narrower topic of translation. Translation is a live subject everywhere in Asia today. But when we talk about translation in Asia, one type of example tends to dominate and occupy the whole subject, namely translation between European languages and Chinese, Korean, and Japanese, as this has been practiced since about 1900. By translation, I mean, of course, translation in communication in 2 directions. Works getting translated from European languages into Asian languages, and works being translated from Asian languages into European ones. These are 2 vastly different types of translation, as we can see just by looking superficially at quantity and impact. In the China field, which is the only one I'm competent to say anything about, the translation of foreign works is nearly synonymous with the existence of a modern literature. And so the study of translation tends to become identified with the study of this literature, which draws more conspicuously for its models and effects on Russian, French, and English writing of the last 200 years than on earlier Chinese poetry and fiction. As Liang Qichao wrote in 1920, the second age of translation in Chinese history has arrived. We are today, he says, 今第二度之翻译时期至. He's writing in 1920 and referring back to the earlier epoch of Buddhist translations, starting in the Han and the Nanbei Chao, 6th dynasty, all that stuff. And that second era of translation is not over yet. As Xie Shaobo puts it, translating modernity and translating China are more or less the same project. Or as Lydia Liu puts it, Chinese modernity is translated modernity. The turn toward the foreign was motivated by a feeling of lack, exhaustion, and defeat, as if the 3,000-year history of China had finally run its course and needed to be replaced by something else. If you read Chinese writings from 1920 or 1900, this sense of collapse is manifest everywhere. That is a rather extreme expression of marginality and can stand for the profile that translation takes on when it is a channel of communication from center to periphery, from the haves in terms of cultural value to the have-nots. 100 years later, that dynamic is still active in our scholarly accounts. As those who recognize the importance of translation for modern Chinese literature and thought must also defend that recent tradition from the charges of derivativeness, marginality, and superficiality. So we see attention given, justly, to the aspects of selection, creative adaptation, and originality in the archive built up by Chinese translators over the last 100 and more years. On the other side of the communication channel, the situation differs greatly. When texts from China are translated into French, English, or German, inter alia, the case is sometimes made that these are works that have the potential to transform the poetic language, the mental orientations, or the society and politics of the West. For such affirmations, you can see the work of Ezra Pound, Joseph Needham, A.C. Graham, Roger Ames, just to give a few examples. But this belief is far from a majority one, and is often taken as the mark of an unusual eccentricity. Moreover, in such acts of translation, the translator is highly visible. Pache Lawrence Venuti's general argument that translation in the West enforces invisibility on the translator. We readily concede to Pound, Whaley, or Hawkes the task of inventing Chinese poetry for our time, and we accept translations by people who do not actually know the language being translated from, because it is expected that the necessary information will be far out of the way of the ordinary reader and not subject to wider verification. My favorite example of this is the man who, in 18th century England, presented himself as a native of Formosa, and he invented a whole civilization. He published several illustrated books about the culture of Formosa. He had never been to Formosa. It was all coming out of his head, and people in England absolutely believed him. Right? That's what you can do when the channel of translation is very sparse, when there's not much signal going through from one end to the other. For inhabitants of a peripheral culture, translation is necessary, imposed. Sometimes it's a lifeline. For inhabitants of a central culture, translation is optional, decorative, or at most educational. And quite apart from the individual personalities and motivations of the translators, we might add that translation into a dominant culture reinforces that cultural dominance. It adds a resource to the treasury of readers and thinkers who speak that major language. It expands their world. It transfers a wealth of experience, making those already rich in prestige yet richer, rather than compensating for a perceived lack, as in the case of translation, toward a less dominant language. A bright kid who grows up speaking one of the minority languages of Russia or China will gain, by going to school and learning the national language, not only the cultural treasures of standard Russian or Mandarin, but all the things that have already been translated into those global languages. Right? So it's a little bit like taking an air or train voyage. You won't be able to go directly from Chuvashia to Hong Kong, let's say, but you get on the plane in the local airport in the Chuvash Republic, you fly to Moscow, from Moscow you fly somewhere else, and then eventually you get to Hong Kong. Right? You have to take the trunk lines in order to get somewhere. Right? You won't have a direct line. With languages, it's the same way as with air travel. Denouncing the linguistic imperialism of neoliberal empire, as some have done in reference to global English, does not obliterate the real benefits conferred by acquiring a major world language. But situations change, and will continue changing, by the way. English was not always a dominant language, enjoying the splendid isolation that is its fate today. A fair number of our English classics, from Chaucer to Shakespeare, to the King James Bible, to the Rubaiyat, the Arabian Nights, and the fairy tales of the Brothers Grimm, are translations. Right? They become naturalized, but they originated as translations. The ground may shift under a dominant language, or an unforeseen development may make a different language into a coveted resource for some or all speakers of the prestigious idiom. One such change is the abrupt shift in status of literary Chinese. Before about 1850, to be educated for East Asian people meant to know literary Chinese. That was synonymous with education. Those who had access to that archive of texts rarely gave much consideration to other literary traditions. There were bilingual, or more properly, biliterate cultures that used writing systems of their own, but Chinese was for them the language of higher prestige and wider circulation. We'll be exploring some of these biliterate situations later. Starting in the 1860s, a wave of translations unseated Chinese from its dominant position. And these translations occurred not first in Chinese, but in Japanese, with Russian being an important source language. Thus, we might even observe an antagonism between literary Chinese and translation. When literary Chinese is strong, the other is weak, and vice versa. In the longer perspective, given the cultural power of literary Chinese, translation is not a continuous practice in China. It's a discontinuous practice. It becomes important at critical, exceptional moments and fades away otherwise. The usual mode of communication over the 3,000 years that I have the temerity to invite you to consider here has been monolingual within Chinese. In talking about translation within China, we will therefore be talking about exceptions to that general monolingual rule. And as always with exceptions, it's natural to ask why they emerge. Is that better? Okay, thanks. Every translation challenges ethnocentrism, at least implicitly, but not too much. A translation is always a negotiation. What will the market bear? What will the audience accept? How great is the appetite for things new and strange? Under the heading of the new and strange, do audiences actually want more of the same old new and strange that appealed to their grandparents, right? The traditional forms of exoticism that simply recycle old tropes? In practice, translators usually negotiate with the majority culture rather than defy its prejudices. As in other realms of communicative behavior, cooperation is preferable to conflict. But sometimes conflict is unavoidable. After all, translators are in the business of transmitting foreign content, and what is foreign can be strange and shocking and thus provoke resistance. How much resistance and how it is to be dealt with varies greatly from case to case, and is going to occupy me through a series of examples. One example that I choose from the Sixth Dynasty period has already been mentioned in my book Translation as Citation. Early translators of Buddhist texts could not really sidestep the fact that, in India at least, monks do not bow to rulers. Right? Shaman, buji wangja. In India, that was already accepted as part of the reasoning behind the system of varnas, or castes, that Brahmins, by their monopoly on religious sacrifice and their abstention from war, were purer than Kshatriyas, the ruler and soldier caste. Although Buddhists departed from many Hindu teachings, notably the teaching of caste purity, Buddhist monks benefited from a tacit grandfathering of Brahmin status on them, and so were not subordinate to kings. But compare that distinction with the universalist flavor of Chinese doctrines about perfect kingship developed in the Warring States period, when it was widely taken that the great problem of society was divided sovereignty. Ideally, hold on. Here we go. Got a slide in the wrong order there. Ideally, there must be no land under heaven. The slide is in the right order. Sorry. There must be, quoting from the Book of Songs, from the Shijing, there must be no land under heaven that is not the king's land. No man as far as the very edges of the earth that is not the king's servant. Right? 普天之下，莫非王土；率土之滨，莫非王臣. As Mengzi put it, the world's problems will be solved when it is brought under one rule. Right? One of the dialogues of Mengzi. 天下恶虎丁，于对曰定于一. That is, after all, the theoretical justification for the existence of the empire. Clerics behaving as if they owed no obeisance to the civil authorities, as if they lived in a world of their own, were an intolerable exception to that universal rule. The people of Hong Kong might like to pay attention to this example. Right? One would-be emperor, Haun Saussy, attempted to force the Buddhist Sangha to recognize his authority and sent a message to that effect to the abbot Huiyuan, who replied with wit and erudition. I do not have the space here to go into the debate itself, but will jump to its conclusion. Beaten in his attempt to achieve dominance over the Buddhist community, Haun Saussy could only conceive the power of translation to bring home extraordinary teachings from far away. He says, if there is someone in this land who can preach the doctrines of time and fate and who can penetrate the customs of remote regions, even those where ninefold translation is required, I ask you, should the king not offer him sustenance, official conveyance, and robes? 有人于此奉宣使命，原通书方九译之俗，问王当之以侯良之以于夫不。And his advisors say, yes, if there is such a person, you should give him all these privileges. By his own theory of kingship, Haun Saussy could not possibly, I suppose, admit the legitimacy of the monk's refusal to submit. So he made this flattering gesture of homage to the translator as if the whole thing came down to a matter of translation. Right? And this phrase, 九译之俗, had already a bit of a past by the time of Haun Saussy's time. In Shiji and Han Shi Wai Zhuan, that phrase is used to indicate the degree of remoteness of the kind of people who come to seek shelter in the Chinese realm. So it's a way of conceding the point without really conceding the point. And in a way, the thing did come down to a matter of translation. The ultra-polite homage to the Buddhist translation enterprise served to put the monastic community at the edges of the empire, in a zone that could be communicated with only by 9 relays of bilingual translators. This is the famous Jiu Yi. The Chinese translating for the Sogdian, who translated for the Parthian, who translated for the Khotanese, who translated for the Uyghur, and so on. To say so was to pretend to be unaware of the fact that thousands of Buddhists were living and building monasteries all over 6 dynasties China, or rather to affirm that they held their tenure there only through the power of the foreign text. How powerful was that text in this context? Literary traditions, like the tyrant Haun Saussy, tend to take their own standards as the ultimate in correctness and to demand that translated works pay homage to them by adhering to their rules. And in fact, that's a game that translators often like to play, right? To nativize as far as possible the foreign text. You know, it's a challenge. It requires a lot of ingenuity. It requires a great knowledge of the language that you're translating into. But it also involves some concessions sometimes. Huiyuan was up to the challenge in his specific moment. His reply to Haun Saussy turned on ingenious interpretations of passages in Zhuangzi, Lunyu, and other classical Chinese source texts, which he showed he knew better than the officials did. What is called Geyi interpretation, the selective deployment of passages from accepted classical texts in the service of spreading Buddhist ideas, turns on just this kind of clever repurposing, an adaptive use of old texts in new contexts. That is one translation strategy that I see being used again and again in Chinese literary history, and I call it translation as citation. It's a matter of citing the I Ching, for example, as if it were written by the same authorities who wrote the Hebrew Bible, and updating its meaning through a kind of conceptual pun. And you may think I'm joking, but of course there were 17th century Jesuits who did exactly this kind of thing with the I Ching and the Shiji, claiming to unveil the secret meaning of these classics, which had somehow eluded the Chinese for thousands of years. In a lesser degree of improbability that is, we see translators hasten to adopt the conventions and styles of Chinese literary writing, performing an elaborate masquerade, like Matteo Ricci adopting the mannerisms of a Ming Dynasty Shanren or hermit sage. Fidelity to the original was rarely the leading concern, and how should that surprise us, since hardly anyone in China could access the originals at the time these translations were done? The translation was going to be read if it spoke to a Chinese audience that had little or no knowledge of the source on which it drew. Without that, it was dead on arrival. This strategy of camouflage, of hijacking, of slipping your meaning under the patronage of an already authoritative but unrelated classic is what we might call a weapon of the weak in the struggle to gain acceptance for translated materials. It subverts and appropriates, taking on the protective coloration of its environment and exchanging identities with what it imitates. Where the need to adapt to the literary environment is felt most strongly, the properties that signal the foreignness of the foreign text are not particularly valued. In a famous passage, the great Buddhist scholar and abbot Dao An, around the year 360 of our era, wrote about the losses, 失本, and the difficulties, 不易, encountered when translating a foreign text. 一胡为秦, translating from hu into qin, as he put it. This passage, with its 5 instances of losing the source and its 3 difficulties, has been treated as a founding document of Chinese translation theory. Luo Xinzhang, for example, in his anthology of texts on translation in China, published in the early 1980s, comments that Dao An strongly puts the case for accuracy. His is absolutely the method of literal translation, demanding faithfulness and precision, taking care that not a word be lost. That's what Luo Xinzhang thinks is going on in that passage, but I actually differ. If we look more closely, I think, Dao An's preface is not actually about translation, but about editing. Dao An was apparently not a speaker of the Hu language, which might have been Sanskrit or one of the several other languages through which Buddhist teachings were first transmitted to China. But Dao An is able to line up translated texts with their source texts, and thus to note discrepancies among them without necessarily being able to interpret the sources. He mentions one text brought to the Jin court as tribute by a Buddhist master from Turfan named Kumara Bodhi, or Jomolwo Bhati, that consists of, he says, 420 leaves, said to contain 20,000 shlokas. Shloka being a verse or a stanza, a couplet maybe is the best translation. A shloka, he says, consists of 32 letters. The Hu number their classics and sutras. When counted up, there are in all 17,260 shlokas in this document, including an excess of 27 letters. In all, there are 552, 475 letters. Okay? So he's got a foreign document. He can say certain things about it, and he can note its format, but he's not actually reading it. Now, a rough and ready quantitative analysis on the level of verses and sections is easy to carry out on this basis. In the same way, if you gave me a bilingual legal document in Turkish and Georgian, for example, though I can read neither, I could approximately tell if the 2 language versions contained the same number of paragraphs and sentences. I would still have very little understanding of the document, but I could at least flag obvious problems about missing or added sections. Dao An goes on to explain why discrepancies arise. You know, why you might have 500,000 shlokas, but only 20,000 Chinese characters in the version. That's a fictional example, but it's the kind of thing that happens. And so there, he gives us a long description. I think I have it here. Yeah, there we go, right? When translating from Hu languages to Chinese, 5 kinds of discrepancy may arise. 失本. One is when the Hu words are reversed and made to follow the Chinese word order. The Hu sutras prize substance, 知, but Chinese like pattern, 文. Right? That duality going back to Lunyu, if not even earlier. The Hu sutras are verbose and full of sighs and exclamations. A message may be repeated 3 and 4 times without anyone feeling it tedious. The Hu text may have meaningful notations that appear to be random verbiage, and seeking annotations, you may find that they simply repeat the text. Sometimes, when some matter has already been completely explained, the text recounts it again from another side, doubling back to the previous wording and laying it all out again. Well, I think you can hear through the exquisite politeness of Dao An's writing a bit of impatience with the Hu writers who are so verbose and repetitive and excessive. Right? If they were only a little bit better in the art of writing, they would be concise, they would make their point once in a striking formula, the way you learn to do in classical Chinese. Now, by more clearly defining Dao An's role as that of an editor and not as a translator, we can better understand his position on the so-called losses and difficulties. What he's doing is collating past translations, noting the gaps, and explaining the existence of those gaps by the difference in literary taste between Hu and Qin publics. He remarks on the excesses of Hu literary style, not in the spirit of someone who thinks that the original is precious and must be retained at all costs. Right? So I'm afraid that's one of the points on which I have to disagree with Mr. Luo Xianzhang. But it's explained by an awareness of different customs and different attitudes. His task as editor of the translated Buddhist corpus is guided by the need to ensure that the texts in that corpus will be both complete and consistent. In order to achieve this agreement, Dao An advocates the practice of heban, concordance among versions, which has often been taken to be a synonym of another phrase Dao An uses, andanar chuan, to transmit in accordance with the text. But again, we must remember that comparison with the foreign original is not in Dao An's capacities. He simply seeks to use what he knows about the different translations of the same text to discover the passages that are missing in one or added to another, so that he can ensure that the text that comes out of his workshop will lack nothing. To sum up, Dao An's remarks on translation are issued from the receiving side of the translation, of the transaction. We would not think of him as a translator today if we mean by translator a person with bilingual abilities who restates in language B what someone has already said in language A. Dao An's greatest influence on Buddhist translation, I think, lay in setting up standards and methods for compiling variants and combining those in a final text. Insofar as he was able to apply those methods across the whole of the Buddhist canon as it then existed, he created a new single language library that exhibited high reliability in the sense that we give that word today in testing and statistics. Reliability as opposed to validity. Right? By reliable, we mean that members of a group being examined will be more likely than not to give the same answer to a question. By valid, we ask the different question whether that answer is actually correct. Right? To sort of get a grip on this distinction, you might think about IQ tests. The claim, of course, is made that IQ tests correspond to some property, intelligence, in the minds of people. That's a claim about validity, and it's really a gesture of faith. The best, I think, that you can say for an IQ test is that it might have some degree of reliability, and that a certain number of people will get the same set of answers, and the distribution of answers will follow the standard bell curve, and so on. We can be completely agnostic about whether intelligence exists and still observe the distribution of answers on that kind of quiz. Right? So reliability in translation, a different thing from validity, and reliability is what Dao An is offering us here with his techniques for comparing different versions. So then, in a situation where the equivalence between a Sanskrit term and its Chinese corresponding terms could not be assessed on the basis of a bilingual acquaintance with Chinese and Sanskrit, because of the lack of bilingual subjects, there really were very, very few people who were able to provide any guidance about those equivalences, Dao An sought at least to ensure that the vocabulary of terms used in Chinese would be consistent enough that all Chinese Buddhists would be confident that they knew what they were talking about. This is a good measure. It's essential, I would think, if you're founding a community of people who are to agree with one another in matters of metaphysical opinion that are beyond the scope of direct observation. The scale of operations matters. Dao An, in the late 4th century, already had a vast library of Chinese texts to harmonize. He had only a few foreign informants and very little means of inspecting the so-called original texts, many of which must have been brought to China in memory, not in writing, by those foreign informants. The only way he could do that was by translating without translating, if I may be permitted to lift a phrase from Bruce Lee. You remember, of course, in Enter the Dragon, how there's a fellow who's threatening Bruce Lee and challenging him to a fight, and Bruce says, "I'll deal with you, I'll fighting without fighting," and he persuades him to get into a rowboat, and then he pushes the rowboat away from the ship that he's on and waves goodbye. That's the equivalent, I think, of translating without translating. You find an ingenious way to push the question away and see it float off. In this case, translating without translating is editing. So if we remove from consideration the huge library of Buddhist texts translated or reconstituted from foreign languages, and it is a huge library, right? Everyone knows the appearance of the great Buddhist collection, right? 200 very thick volumes put together by Japanese scholars in the early 20th century. But if we put those translations aside, the archive of Chinese translation pre-1800 shrinks considerably. If we take another step and put aside diplomatic communications, treaties, and other administrative documents addressed to or issued by foreign language speakers, it shrinks yet further. And if we restrict ourselves to considering literary works, that is, documents of imagination, learning, or argumentation, translated from other languages into Chinese, we will have a slender sample to put against the immense library of Chinese literature. I wish in this way to put my subject in perspective, to show why it has so often been neglected, and to argue that the disproportion between native works and translated works in Chinese is a significant fact about Chinese literature, which relates to other features of traditional Chinese culture that we will want to describe, explain, and contextualize. Living in one of Yang Qichao's eras of translation, we may too easily assume that everyone has always lived in an era of translation, or that activities similar to translation, like Dawan's editing projects, are translation, when in fact they are subtly but irreducibly different. Against the contemporary tendency to inflate the term translation, to contend that every act of communication, every relationship, every intervention, every dialogue, every metaphor, every discovery is in some way a translation, I think it is actually beneficial to keep the focus on linguistic difference and the things that mediate between languages and their communities of speakers. Incidentally, there are a couple of methodological points that I'll find myself reverting to a lot. One is the case of the example that hijacks the principle, right? If we're used to thinking about only one example, let's say translation from English into Chinese, and we begin to take that as simply equivalent to translation, we will forget about all the cases of translation that are not English to Chinese translation, right? So the prestige of one example tends to muffle many other examples that are important and can teach us something. So it's important to try to bring those other examples into our perspective. The other is the tendency to use terms without definition of the scope at which they're supposed to apply. Right? So again, using the term translation as if it applied to anything that bridges some kind of difference. It's a lovely gesture. It enlarges the world that translators and people interested in translation studies are handling, but it might get us into some suspicious judgments if we're not careful about what objects we restrict our reference to. So nonetheless, I also think it is useful to have in mind the many modes of cultural mediation that approximate translation or do some of its work without quite being identical with it. Right? So there's a category of things that I just call not quite translation. And they're interesting in their own right, in their difference from translation. Let us then draw a narrow boundary around translation, understood as the rendering by bilingual speakers and writers of an original text into a similar text in a different language. Right? So translation in the most banal, literal sense. And then draw a wide boundary around the zone of mediation of cultural difference through all kinds of language-based resources, including editing, cross-media adaptation, and transcription, right? So we'll have translation in the narrower sense, which is a smaller universe of facts, and then translation in broad sense, which will be a bigger but more loosely connected universe of facts. All of these differences are worth noting. Knowing or caring to know which kind of mediation we're dealing with in a particular case will lead us to a clearer view of Chinese literary history and the cultural politics of Asia as a whole. Mediation between different languages and communities can take many forms. There are translators. There are chains of translators, as Huan Xuan's scenario of the 9 relays suggests. There are institutions, like the protocols of monastic revision devised by Daoan to secure reliable versions of Buddhist texts imported by a variety of foreign informants. And not least, there are technologies, like the Chinese writing system, that create commensurabilities between separate peoples. Chinese writing itself, will be both a tremendous enabler and a tremendous obliterator of translation. When a sutra recited or transcribed by a Sogdian or Khotanese informant was paraphrased by a Chinese interpreter and taken down by a Chinese scribe, this translation inward would be followed by further transformations and rewritings that resulted in a satisfactory text in the Buddhist variant of literary Chinese. Right, this is the way that sutras were translated. And in fact, there's a whole technical terminology for the stages of chu. They always talk about chu jing, right? Bringing out or making emerge a sutra. And there's someone who does first the kou yi, and then there's someone who does the bi shou, the first transcription. And then there's, ru hua, ru se, and so on, for making up the final acceptable version of the literary text. This final Chinese text might very well be carried with the spread of Buddhism to a country where translation outward was now required. Right? So you've got translation into Chinese that results in a Chinese Buddhist sutra, and then if it's carried off to Korea or Japan, then some form of translation outward would be required, or mediation outward would be required to give the literary Chinese text a vernacular rendition in spoken Vietnamese, Korean, Japanese, or some other idiom. Because although you had texts in literary Chinese and educated people were competent in literary Chinese, the Buddhists were not content simply to speak to the literate and educated fractions of the population. There had to be some kind of vernacularization taking off from there. The vernacular rendition did not necessarily change the appearance of the characters, only their sound values, right? This is the famous kun and on readings in Japanese, and you know about the similar institutions developed in Vietnam and Korea for regulating pronunciations and usages of characters. So the vernacular rendition affected the sound values, but not the appearance of the characters. And to some degree, it would have affected their connotations and their availability to readers of differing education levels. There's, in fact, a wonderful project devised by Sarah Schneewitt of the University of San Diego, attempting to assess what the reading levels required by certain very commonly studied texts of the 17th century was. So, if you were capable of reading, let's say, the Qian Si Wen, right, the 1,000-character classic, then what other texts in the tradition could you read? Or could you read what percent of a certain text? So, if you had the Qian Si Wen, maybe you could then go on and read 60% of Mengzi, right? I mean, I'm making up these figures, but it's a very important tool because literacy is not an on and off switch, right? You acquire a certain number of characters, a certain body of knowledge that allows you to go on and read certain other books. But different readers have different degrees of competence, and so this is a very ingenious use of digitally available texts to give you a kind of an automatic rating of the difficulty level of these texts. And so it's called the textual sieve, S-I-E-V-E, and it's available somewhere online. I can't give you the exact address. But anyway, it's a very useful tool for conceptualizing how writing worked out in the different communities where Chinese characters circulated, without necessarily being the idiom used by people on the street. So, all right, so we've got vernacularization, right? In a further transformation, writers of the local scripts that had been invented in countries where literary Chinese was used internationally, again, I'm thinking obviously of Korean script, Japanese hiragana script, the Vietnamese various Chunam and other scripts. Writers in those local scripts that had been invented in countries where literary Chinese was used internationally might paraphrase, allude to, or otherwise reinscribe the text that had come so far in Chinese form and endured so many changes. Is vernacularization of this kind translation? Yes and no. I'll talk about this a little bit more in an upcoming lecture. But for now, let me just say that I think it's another case of not quite translation. Right? It's got a lot in common with translation without being totally synonymous with it. And we'll want to say exactly what it is we will need to, and to say exactly what it is, what this not quite translation is, we will need to imagine in more detail the scenes of its reception. So here, I'm just going to launch into a bit of science fiction. Consider a Korean literatus of the 16th century. Let's say a young man who's studying for the exams in Korea. He may have been trained from his earliest youth to recite, comment on, and write essays about Chinese classical texts. For him, it is absolutely not a foreign language, although his pronunciation may not be that of Beijing. Right? He's pronouncing everything in Korean style. He no doubt also possesses the specific script of Korea, because you see, I set the date for the 16th century, so King Sejong has long since invented and promulgated his script for Korean sounds. And our imaginary literatus can express the ideas of the Chinese classics in that script as well. For that man's sister, unless they belong to a family that goes to extremes in its embrace of the literary ideal, Chinese script is probably a foreign language, and Korean script is the written form of her spoken language. Now, when brother and sister talk together about the Cheongju interpretation of Mencius, as I am sure they must have done, because what else is there to talk about anyway, how much of their conversation vernacularizes the Chinese text, and how much of it translates it? In this one imaginary family, we find the extension of Chinese script to new territory. Right? You've got education in the original text of the classics. People are not reading a Korean paraphrase of Lunyu and Mengzi and Zhongyong and so forth. They're reading the original Chinese text. We've got translation outward, as when the content of those classics is mediated for a non-reader of Chinese, right? You know, the brother says to his sister, would you believe this? You know, Mengzi says that, you know, men and women are never supposed to touch each other, even to pass an object. And she says, no. Is that possible? He says, yeah, it's right here. And then he translates the passage, right? And you have a certain kind of translation inward if the Korean scholar should be moved by his sister's responses. You know, his sister is indignant and says, what's wrong with this Mengzi guy? I understand he had problems with his wife, too. Then maybe he will draft an essay in Chinese that calls on her ideas, originally expressed in the Korean language, right? All this is totally possible. It's science fiction, but it's totally possible. All right, quiz question now. Is our Korean scholar situated outside or inside China? What do we mean by China? Do we mean cultural China? Do we mean political China? Do we mean some kind of a geographic or ethnic expression? Well, for a good part of Chinese history, Gaogoli was without doubt a territory of the Eastern alien peoples, or Dongyi. Right? For another part of Chinese history, Gaogoli was subject to China, right? Particularly in the Han Dynasty. By the time of our imaginary Korean family in the Middle Ming, Korea was as well integrated into the Chinese cultural and political system as it could be without being an actual province. Koreans were known to sit for the examinations in China, right, which meant writing essays in perfect classical Chinese. They passed the examinations, right? They got office. I mean, that's sort of the ultimate proof of cultural assimilation. And they wrote poetry and prose that could be included in Chinese anthologies. You find it in the Lila Abu-Lughod and things like that. After the Qing invasion in 1644, as you know, Koreans remained officially loyal to the Ming calendar and rituals, and even went so far as to give themselves the name of Zhongguo, the central land, right? And sort of bemoaning the fate of China, which had fallen to barbaric people. I can well imagine that our Korean scholar would be indignant if we said that his vernacularization of Mengzi or Zhuxi was a translation into a foreign language. Foreign language? What do you mean foreign language? You know, of course we use our local pronunciation. Everybody does. That's not translating into a foreign language. What do you mean by foreign anyway? So consideration of these facts must be fed into the question of just what place to give translation in the cultural traffic between China and Korea and other outlying regions. For when we say translation, we are implying foreignness, difference, failure to understand, a gap that must be overcome through translating labor. And the people on both sides of that gap may have differing estimations of how big the gap is. Denizens of the center may have a different appreciation of what linguistic competence means than denizens of the peripheries. Men may see it differently from women. Members of different social classes may understand translation in their own ways, and so on. I think you can anticipate that my advice is not to seek a single, clear, univocal measure of what translation is, but to develop as many situated profiles of translation and quasi-translation in context as we can, so as to delineate a whole field in all its varied shadings. As so often, technology, here the technology of Chinese writing, disturbs typologies made by and for humans. I'm going to stop momentarily and drink a little bit more coffee. Good stuff. So, technology. Right? The adoption of this technology renders moot the usual issues of equivalence. How do you say ren and yi in Korean or Japanese or Vietnamese? How do you say Zhongyong, Tianming, Sancong Sida, or any other tags and slogans of traditional morality? You can anticipate where this is going. Were we to say that these meaning units can only have originated in Chinese and were exported to Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, we would be making an ethnocentric cultural claim. Right? We'd be saying, those people had no idea what ren and yi were until we brought them our classics and taught them, and then they became civilized. Well, that's an awkward claim to make. Right? It might not be totally wrong, but it would be a bit awkward. On the other hand, were we to assert that the Chinese phrases merely came to give a new form to moral intuitions that pre-existed Chinese literacy in those territories, you know, here I'm sort of doing the Wang Yangming thing and saying everybody has Liangxin, right? They must have known what ren and yi were before we gave them the words for it, and so, you know, their translation comes to confirm an intuition that's intimately inscribed on the human heart and not necessarily inscribed in a book, right? If we made that claim, though, we might bring comfort to national pride, right? Our wonderful concept, you know, patented in China, but universal in circulation. But at the same time, we'd seem to confirm the universality and inevitability of ideas that do, after all, have a particular place and time of origin, right? Somebody had to think up those concepts and articulate them together and articulate them with other concepts. Most likely, the terms of Chinese ethical discourse, like the terms of Chinese law, administration, technology, religion, medicine, and so forth, imposed themselves on and reconfigured some existing terms, but did so with the power of words that came with an already developed system of implications and institutions. Although the actual stages of the adaptation are now inaccessible to us. Although, of course, I could give you a science fiction scenario, but I've already done that once today, and I think I have license to do it only one time per day. So although the stages of the actual adaptation are inaccessible to us, we can assume that rather than a proposed equivalence between mutually distinct terms, as we might suppose is the case wherever translation occurs, in the spread of Chinese writing and its related institutions to new territories, what happened was in the nature of an inscription. That is, an imposition on local material of an external form. Right? Presumably, people had all kinds of human relations, you know, family relations, client-patron relations, you know, master and servant relations, whatnot, and the new terms articulated those relations in a new way. In a book called The Genesis of East Asia, Charles Holcomb makes the case for China's possessing an empire of ideas over its neighbors through the spread of its written characters. I don't believe I have a slide for this, but let's see. Maybe I do? No, I don't. We'll go back. All right. So I'll give you the little quotation from Charles Holcomb. He says, kanji, you know, he's for some reason adopting the Japanese pronunciation, maybe because he's afraid of tones. Who is afraid of tones? Not I. But kanji, hanzi, are tied inextricably to a particular set of ideas, to a specific vocabulary or ideology. The use of kanji throughout East Asia therefore creates an empire of ideas, which simultaneously reinforces and circulates Chinese concepts, and excludes other ideas, or at least makes their expression difficult. For this reason, they are the most powerful glue that could possibly bind together East Asia. Right, thus far, Charles Holcomb. Okay, I would say, this is a pretty good postulate. But ideas seem to me a vague and weightless sort of thing. It was an empire of words, concepts, rules, institutions, standards, measures, rituals, behaviors, texts, and relationships, right? Not just concepts, held together by moral and logical obligation, and if necessary, by military force. That's what's implicit in the Chinese character. And here's an illustration. In the year 590, now we go on to the next slide. In the year 590, right, so somewhere between the Han occupation of Korea and the scenario I was inventing for the Ming period, somewhere about a third of the way in that history, after quelling and absorbing the Chen Empire and thus reunifying northern and southern China for the first time in 300 years, Emperor Wen of the Sui, right, Sui Wendi, turned his attention to his northern frontiers, in particular to the tributary state of Goguryeo, right, or Galgodi, as I was calling it just a moment ago, following the Chinese characters. Goguryeo, the biggest of the Korean kingdoms. He sent the Goguryeo king a strongly worded letter, which read in part, and here you have it. Right? Oops. Having received the mandate of heaven, the Tianming, we cherish and maintain the lands in our care, appointing subordinate kings to supervise borders and seas and to carry out the transforming mission of our dynasty, so that all humanity may live in happiness. Right? I particularly love the Yuanshou Fangzu, the portrait of human beings as having round heads and square feet, right? Because round head like Tian, square feet like the earth. The yearly tribute missions sent by your vassal state have been scanty and insincere. As our subject, you should comply with our designs, blocking the Moha tribesmen and the Khitan invaders. But in the past, smugglers, petty men inspired by greed, and bandits have taken control of your kingdom. We have bestowed on you territory and rank, singular benefits and kindnesses, and honor without limit. From today forward, there must be a change. Your country is small and its population thin, but under the whole of heaven, none but is our subject. So you can look through this little passage for all kinds of words that are redolent with ethical implications as well as political ones, right? There's a whole scenario of sort of the obligation of the lesser king to the greater king, and of the greater king to heaven, and to generally admitted principles of justice. And these terms leave the Goguryeo king very little room for maneuver. Right? It's as if to dissent from these terms would be to accept that he's just going to be one of these bandits and petty people, right? One of these nusho, right? One of these xiaoren who are right? Who are climbing around, creeping around like mice and invading the well-ordered domain. Right? So this language really leaves the king very little alternative but to submit. It seems to me that that language, the language of international relations wielded by Sui Wendi's officials, predetermines the outcome of the dialogue. The terms themselves are so heavily loaded with connotations that worked in the center's interests, the center being here presented as the source of virtue, beneficence, justice, and peace, that it is hard to frame a ritually correct answer that would not be a capitulation. Right? So you're against justice, are you? You're against peace, are you? Yeah. There's really no easy answer to that kind of entrapment question. Yeah. The means of communication has the effect of shaping the content of any possible reply. The Chinese written language was one of the institutions, participation in which presumed acceptance of a set of power relations and possible subject positions that were not easily open to renegotiation. Except, of course, by circumstances. As it happened, the threats from the Sui dynasty proved hollow. When the Chinese, a few years later, under Sui Yangdi, mounted an invasion of Goguryeo along the Liao River in 612, they were thoroughly defeated. Goguryeo kept its territory, and the Sui dynasty, exhausted by imperial overreach, collapsed a few years later. This outcome has not prevented mainland Chinese scholars from taking Sui Wendi's letter at its word and asserting that in these terms, Goguryeo was actually a Chinese territory, provoking predictable backlash among Korean historians. Right? This is a controversy that was in the news a few years ago. A further testimony to the power of Chinese writing is that the early history of all the peoples of the area is to be found only in the ethnographic sections of the Chinese dynastic histories, with all the biases and selectivity that one might expect. So imagine that, right? If the early history of Japan, Korea, Vietnam, the steppe peoples and so forth is not written in the languages of those peoples, but in Chinese, that puts them in a kind of a funny position regarding their past. And of course, in recent times, archaeology comes to supply the missing record and to give people other ways of guessing about the actual patterns of settlement and who was in contact with whom and so forth. But we in Chinese studies have a long-standing bias in favor of written sources. We really think that archaeologists are people who dig up pots, and the only good thing about a pot is that it might confirm a written text, right? I'm giving you a caricature here, by the way. This is not the way that we actually behave, but sometimes when we get lazy, that's the way we treat archaeologists. Peter Kornitsky and Zef Handel, give you a couple of references here, have recently written histories of the international circulation of the Chinese writing system. And these are two very recent books, so this is a currently hot topic. I recommend consulting these books. So they've written histories of the international circulation of the Chinese writing system, including the vernacular reading of Chinese and other languages, such as Korean, Japanese, Vietnamese, and Tangut, right, the language of the Xixia, and the development of new scripts on an initial Chinese basis, again, true of all the peoples I've just mentioned. In each such case, a script diglossia was created, with one script serving for high culture and international communication, and another script for local communication, often vehicling less prestigious content. My search for an example now shifts over to Japan. The two prefaces supplied for the Kokin Wakashu, the Gujin Hogeji, let's see, oops, wrong keyboard. There we go. Okay, these are fairly famous prefaces for one of the earliest Japanese poetry collections, a collection of poems in Japanese. There are two prefaces, one written by Kino Yoshimochi and one by Kino Tsurayuki, and they've been very well analyzed by Tim Wickstead in this article, An Oldie But Goodie. Other people have revisited this question, but I think his description is very fine and perceptive. And these two prefaces, one in literary Chinese and the other in Japanese, written for the same collection at around the same time, nicely frame the conditions of this bilateral or biliteral sensibility. Although the collection consists of waka poems, Hoge, in Japanese, Yoshimochi's preface in Chinese directly imitates the preface to the Shijing and argues that Japanese vernacular poetry meets in every way the standards of that timeless Chinese work. Tsurayuki's preface in Japanese, on the other hand, argues that waka poets are even better than Chinese poets at expressing their uniquely acute feelings. Right? So there's, on one preface, the preface written in Chinese is sort of a gesture of cultural allegiance to China, and the preface in Japanese is a gesture of competition, right, and a claim of superiority. But of course, nobody in China would ever read the preface written in Japanese, so it's okay, right? No harm, no foul, as we say. Although, as Tim Wickstead puts it, there is no new critical theory in the Kokinshu prefaces, the concrete vocabulary of the applied criticism in the prefaces evidences a sensibility that is not subject to Chinese models. Right? So there's a nice discrepancy between announced principles and the actual practice of the poetry readers. This brings out rather nicely the difference between an acquired semantic framework, the result of an imposition or inscription of a written culture from elsewhere, and the sometimes unruly manner to which the framework might be applied. Naturally, some Japanese writers wrote absolutely competent and correct Chinese verses and were proud to have them anthologized alongside the work of Chinese authors. But that is the way a peripheral subject responds to the center's expectations. For whom were the Kokinshu prefaces written? Certainly not for a Chinese audience. Communication with China was rare, and no Chinese reader at the time would have made the effort to learn Japanese in order to read waka poetry. The first time someone signals waka poetry as interesting enough to learn to read in its own right is a 16th century work. What is it called? I forget. Anyways, it's a kind of a description, travel narrative of Japan that goes into some detail about Japanese poetry writing sessions. But so that would be many centuries in the future. Yoshimochi's Chinese preface is addressed to other Japanese competent in Chinese, people who had internalized the standards of Chinese poetry and may have needed to be persuaded of the importance of poems not in Chinese. It's as if you need to give a little boost to the local poets, because otherwise people will think that they're just marginal and trivial. Tsurayuki's preface relies on exactly the same Chinese sources for its authority, but promises that the poetry will surpass those sources in a language and a form all its own. On what conditions, though, can Tsurayuki's claim be verified? The masterpieces of Heian literature, like the Tale of Genji, the Pillow Book, and the like, would not be translated into Chinese until the second half of the 20th century. Alas, nobody in China was interested in those works. And I often teach things like surveys of Asian literature, and I have to admit to my class that, in fact, that it was several different literatures that were not talking to each other until the 20th century. A great deal of recent translation theory has turned on the position of English, or global English. This is one of my prestigious examples that sort of drowns the principle. Right? It is seen as both enabling and repressing international communication and constraining the terms in which ideas can be circulated. I feel that these discussions are hobbled by the failure to articulate something more general. What, in general, is the role of a dominant monolingual culture? What does it make happen? How do those who are outside that culture respond to it and negotiate with it? Having a theory, as opposed to having a grievance, means seeing causes and effects, rights and wrongs, in more than one context, and submitting the case to the judgment of a wider public in both space and time. In my next lecture, I'll take the examination of translated literature in Asia back to its beginnings by asking, can the barbarians sing? But that's all for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Saussy. Now we give some time to Liao Laoshi to do a response to this very interesting talk.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, thank you, Haun. It's been a long time, and you are just as original and imaginative as always. And I always learn from you, either long distance or in person. Whenever we had an opportunity to get in contact with each other. This is an extremely rich talk, and this is also just the first piece of sort of prelude to the whole series. And so, fortunately, I had this morning I asked Hector to send me the digest of your other talks, and got a slightly better picture of what you're going to do in the coming talks. So, but still, the digest kind of scanty, so I need to extrapolate a little bit.
I have to keep you in suspense.
Right. Actually, that's better. That's better. Then that allows my imagination to kind of roam, to 逍遥游, roam and revel a little bit.
That's what we're all about.
Yeah. Right. Okay. First of all, I like to just say maybe China began to feel that it has some kind of deficit much earlier, maybe after the Chanyuan Treaty, AD 1005, after Song signed his treaty with LIAO, and became brother to the LIAO, became the older brother to them. But in the past, China was always like the father rather than the brother of a foreign country or foreign culture. So I think, according to Ge Zhaoguang, after that Chanyuan Treaty, China became aware of the fact that it was just one of the international states, rather than the center of the world. So it became aware of the international stage, and China was just one of the maybe better states, but just right next to it, there was a very strong state which he had to constantly negotiate with, and they had to give money to LIAO every year, even though they maintained to be the older brother, but they gave money, to the LIAO state to appease them, to maintain peace between these two states. So I think after that point, China became gradually inward. It became it became more and more like a nation state rather than an empire. Empire in the pre-modern sense, which is culturally pluralistic and polyglot. But after the beginning of Song Dynasty, China became more or less, a quasi nation state. Not a real one, but it becomes more and more focused on itself as being one nation, and begin to talk about the foreigners, especially the nomads, as barbarians in the derogatory sense, a much more derogatory sense, sometimes animals. But before that, I think, again, according to Ge Zhaoguang, there was this Hu and Han division between, the Huaxia and the Danhuaxia. But the Hu Han was a very kind of there's a very let's say porous kind of a boundary between the Hu and Han. And I think in your talk you mentioned that China was probably, even back in those days, nominally culturalist, meaning they considered the identity of being Chinese or Chineseness to be cultural rather than ethnic. But I think, again, Ge Zhaoguang believes that before Song, it was much more so and much more cultural. The Chinese identity was much more cultural than ethnic. But maybe after Song, it became more and more ethnically oriented, the Chinese identity. Especially after the Mongol occupation of China, rule of China, and the Ming Dynasty was completely inward-looking and xenophobic. So maybe we need to, set a kind of a divide between this Chanyuan Treaty, before Chanyuan and after Chanyuan. Before Chanyuan, the division was between Hua and Yi, with not that much derogatory sense attitude to the idea of Yi. But after Chanyuan, you have this. Sorry, before that was Hu Han, but then after that became Hua Yi. And then Hua Yi becomes a kind of a division between human beings and animals, and especially after China was conquered by the Manchus. So there was a lot of talk about, now we're being ruled by the animals and all that. And so that was the first thing. Maybe I'd like to complicate your argument with a little bit, just a little bit, yeah. And in fact, Xu Zhuoyun also argued that during the Tang Dynasty, the Tang Emperor was actually both the Khan to the Turks in the north and the Emperor to the Han in the south. So there was a dual state structure where the Chinese Emperor was able to both rule to a certain extent, rule both sides. Even though, of course, the nomadic empires, was very amorphous. They change their shape, their governing structures all the time. But he managed to, as legend has it, he could speak Turkic, one of the Turkic languages, and actually chided one of the invaders by saying that you betrayed, you actually breached our treaty, and you have to retreat and all that. So, so you can imagine, one can imagine that under, even though, of course, like you mentioned in maybe one of your digests, that in the official account of the Tang culture was very different from what we find in the Dupuan case. Yeah? And I think that's the case. That's actually the case. So one can't just look at the official account. It was the state ideology, but how people actually live their lives is more important than what we read from the records, historical records, documents. And so this brings me to a second point, which is whether or not China was, at the very end you mentioned this again, right? What is the role of the dominant monolingual culture or whatever? And you're constantly making comparisons, maybe not constantly, a few times, making comparison between, classical Chinese culture and English culture, like modern contemporary English culture. Yeah. But sometimes, I mean, you're one of the kind of paradigmatic comparatists. Yeah. So what I'm doing right now is kind of Lu Ban, Men Qian, Shuo Da Dao. Yeah. Okay. Because it seems to me that in this particular talk, you started with the intention of trying to complicate things. But I just, from time and again, I got this feeling that you seem to feel that there's some kind of Han continuity there. Of course, at the end you single out the Manchu difference. Yeah. But other than that, maybe everything was like, it's more or less a continuity. You seem to imply that. Yeah. But of course, I would argue that before the nation state was founded, China was constantly changing. You know that. Yeah. But it just that you kind of lapsed into this maybe unintended belief that there was some kind of continuity. So you're saying that China is not that. China is not what you think. Yeah. But the more complicated side of Chinese culture, of course, you have pointed out, especially in the case of translation. Yeah, and I think that's the kind of what you call not quite translations. Fascinating. But my contribution to this, if that could be called contribution, is that that kind of what happened in the Korean example might have happened all over China. Right? So China itself was a polyglot culture, rather than a monolingual culture. Monolingual culture is the official culture, which is a scriptural culture rather than a phone culture. It's not a culture of sound, and so I believe that this little difference makes a big difference, because the Chinese script is not very straightforwardly phonetic. It is, to a certain extent, phonetic, if you know the rules. But it's, theoretically, to become, or to receive Chinese culture, or to become assimilated into Chinese culture, there's no test of shibboleth, right? You don't test the pronunciation of all these classical Chinese texts. And you just, if you can write it, understand it, you are Chinese. Right? But in the case of modern English, culture of English, then you have to, you better speak with a decent accent, right? Otherwise, you're considered not good enough. Yeah? So So, in China, the diglossic phenomenon is much prominent than in other cultures. Even though, in every culture there's this diglossic difference between, there's a phenomenon of diglossia with 2, or even 3, or more than that, layers. Yeah. But in China, the difference is huge all the time. You go to Hong Kong. If you don't know Chinese, at least northern Chinese, they go to Hong Kong, they think they've been there in a foreign country. Yeah. My Korean Chinese roommates, when I was a freshman in Taida, I talked to these friends of mine. These roommates. The friends of my roommate. Korean, overseas Chinese from Korea, and they said, let me just use their accent. They said, 我以为台湾是我祖国，到了台湾一句话都听不懂。Because Taiwan was my 祖国, and then when I arrived in Taiwan, I couldn't understand a word. Because the first I think the first language they got into contact with was Minnan, the Minnan dialect, and it's for people who do not speak the language. It's just completely, incomprehensible. So, and that's the fact of China. So, I just like to point out the fact that, I think you're well aware of the fact that it seems that in your talk, this fact has been kind of somehow sidelined or ignored. The fact that the Chinese, it's a Chinese script, not the Chinese language. So China itself, or even the Chinese culture, is not is always already multicultural. To a great extent, multicultural. All culture is multicultural, but Chinese culture has been, maybe until the founding of the nation state, has been very, very multicultural. And so the example of Gao Xianzhi would come in handy. Gao Xianzhi, like you said, was a descendant of the Tang Dynasty general, who famously participated in the Battle of Talas in Central Asia, Uzbekistan maybe, and fought with his expedition forces fought with the Sabine, or whatever, this Arabic dynasty, armies from the Arabic dynasty, and they were defeated. And that was the end of Chinese Western expansion. But that was also the beginning of Western civilization. Gunpowder, paper making, all these techniques were transmitted to the captives to Europe. I was just joking, but more or less.
To be true.
Right. Yeah. Okay, but he was a descendant of Goguryeo, Koreans. But for me, it's just very difficult to use the word Korean. Was there an idea of Korea yet? I don't think so. No. Back then, you have this country called Goguryeo, and you have Silla, you have Shindo, Pakchai. You have all these different countries. They are vying for dominance on the peninsula and in Manchuria, and that is it. There was no Korean. There was no identity of being Korean. Yeah, and so under this very multicultural, even multinational empire, switching loyalty was very easy. Their family was relocated to Gansu, and he was second generation. So there was no, I think, for Gao Xianzhi, his identity was just Chinese or Tang identity, rather than Goguryeo, whatever, Korean. So my point is that from the very beginning of China, all the way maybe up to the end of Tang, China was multinational, multicultural, and all that. So switching identity was not a problem at all. So when you said at the very end of your talk that we need to somehow rediscover this Manchu cultural pluralism. You know, I totally agree with you. That the Manchu rule of China was very, very clever, and to a certain extent respectful of cultural differences. Yeah. That's why they, you know, I'm not being too long. A few more minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So they, right after they conquered China, they converted to Lamaism in order to form and close the bond with the Mongols and all that. So they're very clever. But the thing is, if you go back to the warring states, you go back to the Tang Dynasty, you find similar situation. It was not, the Manchu dynasty was not a kind of unprecedented case. So it has echoes already in earlier times. Yeah. And a friend of mine who is a professor of history at Taida, I invited him to give a talk for our series, under which you will be talking to. He gave a talk on what was the historical China, and I used this idea of tianxia. I used this idea of tianxia to understand China as not a kind of a colonial empire, nor a nation state, I mean historical China, but a kind of a land which is kind of unified by the idea of tianxia. But tianxia does not require political unification. You just, if you have the culture and you're part of tianxia, the boundary of tianxia could change all the time, metamorphosizing into something larger, smaller. For instance, Korea and Vietnam used to be maybe part of tianxia, and now they're not, for instance. So, well, you know, that's the third point I'd like to make. That Huaxia, kind of like tianxia, was originally a very decentered idea, and also it's constantly changing. In fact, China is not constantly changing too. I mean, maybe the only continuity is the characters. The characters change too, right? Last but not least, I just like to point out something that I am working on at the present time. That was the, you know, the kind of cultural pluralist, the kind of all the cultural differences that we witness in historical China, or you know, from earlier China to the very present time. There's something which is very conspicuous. You know, so that maybe is a good place to begin to explore the kind of multi-cultural national China. That is the dual, what I'm working on is the dual temporality of China, which basically could be divided into northern and southern. Yeah. The northern is very committed to the idea of tian, which implies a strong, of course, mandate, but also continuity. If you have the tian, then you have China. Yeah. The tian is there fixed almost. He's giving the mandate, or it is giving the mandate all the time if it deserves the mandate. Yongzhen would argue that, quoting Shangshu, you know, 皇天无亲，唯德是佛. The Tian heaven is not closed to anybody. He only assists those who are virtuous. And to argue that, you know, being a Manchu, I can rule China too, because I have the mandate. But then, you know, the southern one can be attributed to the Taoists. The Taoists, for them, the temporality is just constant becoming. There's nothing that is fixed, and it's everywhere. You know, the mandate of Tian is up there. It doesn't really reach to you until you deserve it. So I think that's something only visionaries can see. I'm not one of those. But for instance, Deng Xiaoping saw that.
Really?
Yeah, and that's why he traveled to Shanghai and Guangzhou and then started reform from the south and built Shenzhen. He rescued the Communist Party and China, right? Because he realized that the south, the southern temporality has been suppressed for a long. It was suppressed. You know, at the Soviet reached the high point, that in kind of some kind of tension with Neo-Confucianism. But then, starting from the Ming Dynasty, it began to China's ruling class began to suppress maritime culture, basically so. So they enforced this ban on maritime trade. And then Manchus also again suppressed the Jiangsu area, the Yangtze Delta area. And then, well, the Republic of China is kind of like it from the south. But then the communists, after they conquered China, they again suppressed Shanghai, the whole Yangtze Delta. So until Deng Xiaoping, the south was completely kind of held in check. They are not able to make the best of this alternative temporary. So this is something I mentioned as an example to see that China, if it is not clearly multicultural, it is at least dualist. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. You can take your time, then we'll open the discussion.
Yeah, all right. I'm very grateful to my friend and colleague Sebastian for these remarks. Some of them do, in fact, look on towards the lectures that I've already drafted, but I'm going to hold them in suspense for you for a little while. Well, just to say quickly, I'm absolutely in agreement with you that it's not about an ethnic continuity of a population that is Han and was, the way they are from the beginning to now or something. It's not about that really, but it's about the normativity of the letter, right? So it's less a matter of continuity and more a matter of repetition, right? Because everyone who takes up the conventions of literary Chinese inherits a certain language, a certain set of norms and ways of articulating things. The great example of this would be the so-called barbarian dynasties, the Jin and the Ho Qin and whatnot, right? All of these dynasties that are founded by people riding out of the north, but of course they take up a Chinese form of administration, and they have historiographers who write up their history in beautiful literary Chinese using all of these normative terms, although the leadership were actually quite alien. Here is the normativity of the letter that forms the sort of continuity, the quasi-continuity, and it's a monolingualism, but not, as you say, of speech, but of writing. And that monolingualism filters out a lot of actual life, right? So it achieves its consistency partly by this adherence to convention, and it's very lucky that we have things like the Dunhuang manuscripts that were, of course, not a consecrated official deposit at all, but kind of a chance survival. We could go into that and see a completely different picture of Tang China. And that's extraordinarily precious. So it's really about this interchange between the actual variability, the polyglot nature of China and its outsides, compared to the consistency and, I would say, almost the monotony of the written record that always adheres to those pre-existing norms. North and South is an extremely intriguing idea, right? One thinks of the Jing and the Wei, right? The Jing are the constant principles, and the Wei are sort of the horizontal, actual, lived experiences of people. Southern China reminds me always of what General de Gaulle used to say. He said, How do you unify a country that has 400 kinds of cheese, right? Well, cheese are not really the issue here, but you know, the local cultures of the southern half of China are, of course, extremely discrepant amongst themselves. Northern China is much more, you know, 一味走天下, but the north of the north brings us again into contact with cultural variability. So it's really not just the north and the south, but sort of the middle versus the north, the nomadic north, and the watery south, with these successive waves of people moving down from the north.
But the middle is more oriented toward the north.
That's true.
I think more heavily influenced by the north.
Right,
Like
that is true.
Vientiane, for instance.
Yeah.
Very northern, very nomadic actually.
Yeah, it is. Well,
Yeah.
if you're a nomad, of course, you want to invest your power in the one thing that you don't have to carry with you on horseback. You can't have statues. You can't have nice Aphrodites and Apollos in stone to carry with you on horseback. So I can only promise to give a better and more pluralistic account of Chinese culture and what happens in the successive lectures. I'm very grateful for you alluding to the Tang Emperor seeing himself as both Huangdi and Han, because that happens to be one of the clinching quotes I have later on, where Li Shimin says, Yi ren ye, one of his generals is urging him to go and attack the Yi, and he's, but they're my people too, I'm not going to hurt them, which I think scandalized the official. And yes, there are actually, I think, several eras of fluctuation between the relation between Hu and Han, or Hua and Yi. I see a hardening in the Han, right? And then more porosity in the succeeding centuries. And the Tang too, they had very friendly, intimate relations with their Turco-Mongol neighbors with whom they intermarried and were often bilingual and bi-communicators. And then you have this hardening starting with the Song. So I will be attempting to develop a lot of these ideas. I'm very grateful to you for outlining them so clearly and memorably. Yes, this discrepancy between the written record and the actual life, that's part of the drama, and has to do with the definition of this thing that we suppose we're dealing with, 文学, right? How much gets filtered out by the very discourse of one, right? So that's one of the things that we'll be grappling with in the next 4 sessions. Thank you very much.
So we can open now the discussion. You can also ask questions in Chinese if you want. So
can I have the first question?
Yeah, sure.
That's the first question. So thank you so much, Haun, for this exciting talk, a very stimulating talk, and I'm looking forward to the other lectures as well.
Sebastian, and thank you. Just to understand your mindset or your framework better. So I have like 2 questions. Try to be short. So the first question is because I found this remark very stimulating. What you said on page 3 about these weirdos, it's like Nathan Graham, Roger Ailes, Ezra Pound, so these kind of eccentrics somehow who all believe that there is this potential, like in Chinese, classical Chinese, in particular Chinese thought. And Chinese thought has this potential to transform poetic and other languages in the West.
That view, by the way.
So this.
I happen to share that view.
So I would, maybe you can say more on this, because in a way it's this, maybe what is the future of all this? Maybe how will Chinese language, maybe 50 years down the road or 80 years down the road, we have this economic and political asymmetry between East and West is disappearing in a way. So what will the future bring? And then in a way we could also argue this already has happened. No? For example, if you think in the 18th century, the Orphan of Zhao, this kind of UN drama was translated into Western language, it became very popular, and Voltaire wrote it, and many people, I think, found it literary texts like the Orphan of Zhao making very meaningful claims, and they weren't necessarily understanding these claims as eccentric. So maybe we have just forgotten we in the West have forgotten how the classical Chinese and classical literature has already shaped our pre-understanding.
Right.
So this would be the first question. The second question is about what you just said again in your response to Sebastian about the normativity of the letters. So there is written, I totally agree, there's very powerful, or this normative pull there in Chinese script, that somehow just by writing these characters down, you get involved in all kinds of claims, and you have to accept the worldview. I very much agree. So and it filters out. So you just said ordinary experiences, but how actually is this happening? So for the Chinese, according to the Chinese self-description, these letters are not conventions. No, they are nature. Kind of Chinese script is an extension of nature. So there is no really rupture between nature and culture. And there's this very strong performative aspect. So it's not about really seeing this. It's less about optical experience, reading. It's more about writing. So it's a performative, very strong performative aspect there. And you write, you learn calligraphy, you learn these characters. So what exactly is this kind of normativity? And then you didn't say, I think you didn't mention this other aspect, very important in Chinese culture, that ultimately you have to forget the script. No? Silence is higher than script. So that is in Taoism and even in Confucianism and Buddhism, you all find that ultimately it's not about writing and speaking, but about tihui, some kind of inner vision, or you just mentioned this. So what about silence? We have to forget script, and Chan Buddhism has this, and Dao De Jing, so somehow, what kind of normativity is it there? Maybe you can say more on this, and what happens to this silence when we don't translate it into Western languages? So, is it actually possible to translate? What is it? Tertium, comparationis, I would like to ask you.
Sure. Well, about silence, there are many variants of silence, right? There's the silence which is power, not having to give an answer to things. And there's the silence that's acceptance that one's not going to be able to speak, right? So, there's the, there are many ways to be 下次去汤圆, say, right? The idea of the character as a kind of a revelation of the powers that are in nature, it's a very strong claim, right? There are also within Chinese tradition claims of departure from nature, right? So I always throw Xunzi into the match too, because Xunzi thinks that everything that is Li is good because it's Wei, right? Because it was wrested away from nature, and it had to begin in some departure from human nature and from the ordinary way of things. And it turns out that Xunzi is a less comfortable philosopher to think with, but I think the thinker that most of Chinese institutions have actually followed over time, right? So the assumption is that people need to be corrected. With Mozi, you have a much more cuddly idea about human nature being basically good, and it just needs a little bit of guiding. But with Xunzi, you have to be reformed and strictly observed all the time. Who is the actual architect of practices on the ground? Well, we have to go case by case. But I think Xunzi has a much larger role than he's usually allowed to have. And so with Xunzi, interestingly, there's a move away from the visual and towards the sonic, towards the aural, right? Because it's really music that for him is the art of arts. And perhaps because your music is abstract, you can hear it, but it doesn't have a visual form. It is also just even before you've begun playing a note, by the tuning of the scale, you're already installing a kind of normativity, right? You're going to be playing in C major and not in C minor, right? Simply by the way that the bells are tuned or the strings are adjusted. So there's that sense of art and morals being in some radical way a break. And this has its meaning in relation to this language of continuity, right, of things, of morals naturally growing out of the nature of things. I would like to circle back a little bit to Graham, who was absolutely allergic to Xunzi, and he was such a fan of the Taoists that he really had no time at all for the Confucians, and tried to show in his arguments about history that the Confucians were really bit players, and the major figures were the Taoists. I'm very sympathetic to this case, but I think historically we have to allow the Confucians a little bit more room to influence society in this normative kind of way, because alas, they were in control of the institutions that had the grip on the norms, and the way to be an Angus Graham kind of person was to head for the hills and become a hermit and lead a life on the margins. Another way to do that would be, like Li Zhi, to discover the hypocrisy of all the people who claim to be virtuous. That is a never-ending source of moral reflection for him, usually in the mode of indignation. Li Zhi is a very helpful person to read against the notion that morality sort of springs naturally from the human heart. He's got an account, of course, of a natural morality, but he doesn't find it happening in ordinary social life very much. He's got a wonderful account of how Confucius had an instinct, had a sense of the way, but he couldn't transmit it to any of his disciples. And the ones who were successful are the ones who were compromised. So he is telling the story of Chinese philosophy in a way that cripples it from the very beginning. And of course, he's doing this because he sees himself as antithetical to everybody and everything. It's Li Zhi against the world. And I think it's a marvel that Chinese philosophy could produce such a character. So as you can see, we're jumping right into the very big frog ponds of Chinese thought, where we're no longer frogs in a well, but we're the frogs in the ocean here, contending with the winds and waves. I think so I have accounts of some of these things in what will come afterwards. What else did I want to sketch in for right now? Yeah, I think that will have to do for the moment. Thank you. Yeah. Yes.
Well, thank you, Professor Saussy and Professor Liao. I have a question about. I'm interested about the artist, especially the intellectual artist focused on the author. Is a singer, Tibet, borderland. So focus on the Ando intellectuals. And so they always thinking about the Tibetan language is not finished by Huawen. Yeah, I mean the Tibetan language. Because the Tibetan language, they are quite different from the written language and the spoken language. This quite big deal, big gap. So especially the people who can reading is only limit in the monastery before they are chanting in the temple only. So I have a question about too. Today you just thinking about you mentioned about the thinking from the before the modern period, but from the time before the modern period until the contemporary time, if the context is insistent nowadays. I have a question. One is how to focus on the 复古主义 nowadays, the ritual sense, just 复古主义, especially the contemporary lectures. They looking for the Tang Dynasty. They're looking for the Turbo Dynasty. It's a century test because they nowadays the Tibetan literature they're interested about the 新唐书、吐蕃传. Yeah, and they try the Tang ways to writing the history. Compare nowadays focus on the Buddhists. Yeah, they try the 复古主义. They want to looking for the resource of the Middle Age. So the first question is how to deal with the contemporary literatures, but they are very, very popular, the 复古主义. And the second is, you mentioned about the 玄奘 and the 佛教, the Confucian and the Buddhist, the translation. And the translation is kind of cultural translation as well. But nowadays they have another translation, it's the modernizing. They imagine how is the new state, how is the nation state, how is the democracy, how is the communities. So some Rinpoche, but kind of intellectual Rinpoche, they also translation. They're doing the translation from the Buddhism to communities. Such case just like 东嘎洛桑赤烈, he doing the democracy, 他翻译了民主，用了一个藏文的叫做权法的一个字眼。So how to see the translation? But the translation is the image of the modern life or the modern nation state or the imagination kind of. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Well, translation in modernity. Lydia Liu, Xie Shaobo, several people have dealt with this, but always with the 20th century framework. And so I'm looking for other models in earlier Chinese history. In fact, Tibet is a fascinating case because I was just saying in kind of a generalization that the peoples around China usually have their early history written in Chinese and therefore not in their own languages, but that's not quite true for Tibet, right? Because there are old Tibetan chronicles from the 7th century that are written in Tibetan, and it's fascinating to read these alongside Jiu Tang Shu and Xi Tang Shu, where the same events are recounted, but from opposite sides, and often things that are very important that occupy many, many pages in Jiu Tang Shu are represented by one line in the Tibetan chronicles, right? And these might be fairly important things like the sack of Chang'an in what was it, 763. So this is actually going to come up in one of the later lectures where I get to talk about this a little bit more at length. But very important, very significant for cultural relations is that the diglossia of Tibetans, having their own written language, their own classical language, and a more vernacular form of the language, bumps up against the Chinese character in ways that were not the case for people who didn't have a written language before Chinese was brought in, right? So there are many cases where written language is simply synonymous with Chinese at first, and then another written form is invented on the basis of Chinese, right? The case for the Koreans, the Japanese, the Vietnamese, and others. The Tibetans were already writing in an alphabet derived from India, and so perhaps this creates a translation situation that's extremely different from the one that we see in other places. And yes, I'm not quite sure, just because I don't have the knowledge, how modernist literature occurs in Tibet. I read a few contemporary authors writing in Tibetan or writing in Putonghua who are from Tibet. I'm missing that earlier stage where there must have been some very big transformations of the written language to make it reflect spoken Tibetan, because that was never a priority among the monastic authors. One thing that I think moderates the difference between spoken and written is the existence of a huge oral tradition that is heavily reliant, as far as I understand, heavily reliant on classical Tibetan, right? So these, the epics of Gesar, for example, that are sung for days and days and days, are in kind of a mixed vernacular and classic form, but they're transmitted orally, right? I mean, they're written down, of course, but people perform them to an audience orally. That's got to have some kind of role in the relation between spoken and written. I don't know exactly what it is, but it's somewhat different from what you'd see in other areas that are influenced by Chinese script. Thank you.
So we have time for a last short question. This time is almost over.
Thank you for your great presentation. Thank you for Professor Liao's discussion. I have two very simple questions. On page number 3 at the bottom, you listed pound, whaley, and hawks, and you mentioned at the last line of the page that accept translations by people who do not actually know the language being translated from. In a case like this, hawks is quite different from the case of pound and whaley, right?
Right. Yes, that's absolutely the case. I was thinking more of pound, right? But pound's translations have circulated far beyond those of whaley and hawks. So whaley, obviously, he never went to China, but he could read Chinese and Japanese with absolutely no problem. Hawks spent many years in China and was absolutely fluent. So yeah, I wasn't extending that one case to cover all of them, but it is the case that many translators work with an informant like Kenneth Rexroth, for example. His translations of poems from the Chinese that he did with what was his name, Wang Ling, wasn't it? He never knew a word of Chinese, but he had someone to help, and he wrote things over. And these were, going all around the world. Pound is the great case because, of course, he never really learned Chinese. He had the notes of Ernest Fenollosa, who learned it all from Japanese, to go on. And he was really editing down Fenollosa's notes in a way that's curiously reminiscent of Dao An, turning previously existing scriptures translated from Sanskrit into Chinese, turning them into something more polished and better. But I think what I meant there is simply that the flow of information is so scanty that people are willing to accept a second-hand translation, and as in the case of Pound, to make it absolutely canonical. More people have read Pound's Café than will ever read translations written by, say, my friend Stephen Owen or other scholars who absolutely know what they're talking about. And I think that's just an effect of how few people there were available to do that kind of work in 1918 or 1920.
All right, thank you. And since you are an expert of Chinese language, I would like to ask you Pound's translation of Qing Liu, green willow, into blue willow. What's your comment on this?
Well, he was working from Fenollosa's notebook, and I believe at that point where Fenollosa's teacher in Japan had written the word Qing, Fenollosa then wrote under it blue or green. And so Pound, when he was editing this, said, well, I think blue is more interesting. So he just chose that, but for reasons of his own, right? We now have a much better understanding of what Pound was working from, because Timothy Billings has published all of the Fenollosa notebooks, so we can see exactly what Fenollosa's teachers were telling him and how Pound edited those notes down. And so that's come out. It's called Café, a critical edition, and it really changes the landscape of what we know about Pound. There have been people who have attempted to print facing text of, a good text of the Li Bai and other poems that Pound translated opposite the Pound. But, in fact, that's not reflective of the way that Pound did his work in that at all. So it's helpful to see the Fenollosa versions. And I strongly recommend this. It's a kind of a torturous example of literary adaptation. And in fact, this reminds me of one of the points that I was going to answer in Kai's comments about the influence of translation, right? There is a great tradition of discovering the people in European intellectual history who were receptive to a signal from China. Leibniz, the physiocrats who were studying Chinese texts that had been translated, of course the Jesuits. There's a wonderful book by Louis Maverick, marvelous name for a guy who's doing this kind of work, showing how 18th century thinkers were permeated with Chinese doctrines and put them into practice in a way that caused them no longer to be recognizable as Chinese. Perhaps because, in the milieu of 18th century France, it wouldn't have helped to say that this idea about economics came from far away. So there's this noble tradition of recovering the Chinese originals of things that people have forgotten about entirely. And there are new entries in this genre still coming forth. There's a book coming out very soon by someone named Alexander Staten about a few Jesuits who stayed in China after the Jesuit order had been dissolved and were communicating with French colleagues and telling them about things like Gong Fu and Chinese medicine. And then those French interlocutors were introducing those themes into French discourse, but with no mention of their Chinese origins. So it's one of the origins of mesmerism and animal spirits and psychological healing in the France of the 1770s and 80s that has been obscured until now when this person discovered the traces of this correspondence. So, you know, this is an ongoing enterprise always to find these traces of the translation.
Sorry, what's this book? Is it a new publication? What's this
Yes,
book?
and the book is called, what is it called?
Yet to appear.
It's yet to appear. It's coming out from the University of Chicago Press. And so I was lucky to be asked to be the reader of the manuscript, which is why I have this privileged information, and I'm embarrassed about divulging it, but I'm doing it in the spirit of, you know, 广告, of 宣传, letting people know about this book by Alexander Staten. And, gosh, I've forgotten the title of it. It's got enlightenment in the title. I'll think of it later. Anyway, but so you know, these things are, there's so many of these discoveries yet to be made, and, you know, of course, I cheer every time it happens. I think also in the spirit of Zhang Junmai, you know, that the future of the world is definitely involved with the reception of, you know, Chinese philosophy. And I think that was an extremely bold statement for Zhang Junmai to make in, what was it, 1949 or 50, when he wrote that book about, you know, Chinese traditional thought and the future of the world. Who would have thought that that was a case to be made? But, you know, increasingly we see that that's actually an important case.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
For your marvelous attention, and I look forward to speaking on related subjects for the next few days. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the questions and the discussion. So see you in a couple of days.